Welcome to everybody who joins us on their home screens today. And of course, a warm welcome to everybody who is going to watch the recording of today's lecture later on in the blended learning format. Today, we are very fortunate to welcome a guest from the US. Asoka Bandarage has an MA in religion and PhD in sociology from Yale University. And she has served on the faculties of Brandeis University, Georgetown University, and Mount Holyoke, where she received tenure. Professor Bandarage is the author of several books, Colonialism in Sri Lanka, Women, Population and Global Crisis, The Separatist Conflict in Sri Lanka, Sustainability and Well-Being, The Middle Path to Environment, Society and the Economy, and Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, Colonial and Neoliberal Origins, Ecological and Collective Alternatives, and of course other publications on political economy, ecology, ethno-religious conflicts, as well as mindfulness and social action. And this combination was what made it for us so attractive to invite her to this lecture. And next to all of this, she's also a wonderful speaker with her full heart in the subject. So we are very fortunate to have her here today. Without further ado, I welcome Asoka today to us, and we all look forward to your lecture. I will now start to share my screen.
Yeah, so thank you so much. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be invited to present a lecture in this series on nonviolence and in global perspective, which is hosted by the University of Hamburg and Kyoto University. And special thanks to my friends at the University of Hamburg, Corina Alvar and Professor Michael Zimmerman, for this invitation to take up issues of importance for the world at this time. And thanks, of course, to the students from the University of Hamburg and Kyoto University and other friends and colleagues who are joining me in this session today. So, as Corina and Michael have expressed, the objectives of this series is critical reflection and the development of an ethical framework to promote nonviolence. Needless to say, these are very needed at this time when we have so much conflict, violence, and militarism spreading across the world. So what I'm going to do here is to approach this subject from a broad interdisciplinary perspective as both a social scientist and a student of Buddhism. I will try to present a comprehensive overview on global developments, but I'm not able to provide detailed details or references on each of the different aspects of the global crisis that I will address here. And much of the discussion of alternative problems and references to them, and in fact, hundreds and thousands of references, can be found in my writings. So before we attempt to develop a framework for nonviolence, I think it is important to have context. So what I'm going to do first is to provide an overview of Ahiṃsā, which is violence in the world, and not only the main aspects of violence in the world, but also look at the conceptual framework and the values that are upholding this dominant perspective and dominant trend. So let me talk about structural violence. Now, we know that direct physical violence is easily visible and acknowledged, like killing and murder and suicide and homicide, so on and so forth. However, psychological violence and the interdependence of different forms of violence, like physical and psychological, are often invisible and unacknowledged, particularly structural violence. So what is structural violence? Structural violence or systemic violence is violence that is embedded in social structures and social institutions, harming people, preventing them from meeting their basic needs and rights. So oftentimes, it remains invisible, but it's pervasive, structural violence. So when we talk about structural violence, one very important dimension of that is the environmental violence, which is the destruction of planetary life support systems and biodiversity. Another aspect is increased armed conflict and militarism that's spreading across the world. And yet another, which is not often seen as structural violence, but very much a form of structural violence, is economic inequality, which prevents large numbers of people from access to sustainable livelihoods, basic needs, so on and so forth. So let me briefly look at environmental violence, which I think is known to most of you. Due to human activities like resources extraction, deforestation, and pollution, ecological equilibrium and the Earth's life support systems are breaking down. We can see this in climate change, biodiversity loss, air, water, and soil degradation, and so on. And as we know, global warming is increasing at an accelerated pace. And along with that, climate disasters such as wildfires, cyclones, extreme rainfall, and flooding, as well as droughts, are increasing across continents. Then turning to biodiversity, it's reported that wildlife populations have fallen 73% between 1970 and 2020. This is a massive loss of biodiversity of plants, animals, and non-human species. And it is estimated that up to 1 million species are threatened with extinction in the coming decades. And also, human beings are impacted by this because we are also part of nature. 1 in 3 people in the world do not have access to safe drinking water. And it is estimated that 80% of agricultural topsoil contains pesticide residues impacting human and planetary health. So you see that environmental violence cannot be separated from violence against human beings because they are intrinsically interconnected. So is armed conflict and militarism, which is the biggest destroyer of planetary life support systems, the environment. Now, it is estimated that there are 130 armed conflicts raging across the world right now, and that is twice as many as 15 years ago. So what makes this a part of structural violence is that wars are lasting longer, growing more complex, and trapping entire generations. So I'll just give you some statistics, and these are just estimates. These could be underestimates. For example, the Russia-Ukraine conflict that has been going on for several years has cost 450,000 to 600,000 deaths. The Gaza war, it is estimated over 75,000 lives cost. The civil war in Sudan, which one doesn't hear much about, an estimated 150,000 deaths. The US-Israel war against Iran, 9,600 lives, although by now the numbers may have increased, especially if you add the numbers killed in Lebanon. So we have to look at the larger picture here. Global military spending is now an estimated $2.9 trillion, out of which 60% is attributed to the top 5 spenders. And those are the United States, China, Russia, Germany, and India. Out of the total, the USA accounts for 33% of total military expenditures. And it is interesting to note that Japan has risen to 10th place in global military expenditures, Both Germany and Japan, until recently, until about 2022, were not big military spenders. But because of changing geopolitical circumstances, their military expenditures have risen drastically. And the military expenditures of other European countries and Canada, as well as other countries and regions, are also increasing. So if you're talking, before we can talk about nonviolence, we have to talk about militarization and violence. What are the effects of militarization? What we are seeing happening today is that militarism is replacing diplomacy in foreign policy in the context of armed conflicts. Social sectors like higher education, media, entertainment are being brought within militarized power. So all of this diverts resources from human services and sustainable development. So they are directly interconnected. So what is happening is that there is a normalization of violence and militarism across the world today. And this cannot be understood without looking at extreme inequality. And here again, I'm just going to give you some basic statistics. According to the estimates of Oxfam International, nearly half of the global population lives in poverty. That is, they are living on less than $5.50 a day. Now, contrast that with the world's richest 1%. The richest 1% actually controls more wealth than the bottom 95% of humanity. Now, here we are talking about extreme inequality. The new wealth of the top 1% has surged by over 33.9 trillion since 2015. And according to calculations, this would have been enough to end poverty globally 22 times over. So here again, we see inequality contributes to poverty and also environmental destruction, as I can show later. The wealth at the top is concentrated in the hands of billionaires, particularly in the tech industry, who now control the new forms of property in the technocratic era, such as patents, algorithms, digital platforms, technological infrastructure, and data. And their ownership has spread to other areas of science and technology, including biosciences, as well as media, education, and defense. So if you're talking about peace, we have to look at these realities. So today, the billionaires, corporations, and politicians are able to make policies that undermine life support systems and people's ability to make choices about their lives, and also to suppress dissent and resistance against their domination. So how did the world come to a place of such extremism and structural violence? You know, some people tend to accept this as inevitable. This is part of human nature. Is that really so? Are human beings naturally driven by egoism, the pursuit of power, physical appetites, and a fear of death, as was claimed by the likes of Thomas Hobbes? And this seems to be sort of a popular perspective. Yes, there is no question that nature is not all peaceful and cooperative. Competition, conflict, and violence are interwoven with harmony and interdependence. They involve in a dialectical process. However, what is important for us, if we are talking about nonviolence, is to recognize that there is a plethora of research-based findings which contradict this widespread belief that human violence is attributable to biologically determined aggression. Even Charles Darwin, who spoke about human evolution, argued that altruism, empathy, and cooperation are foundational to human evolution. So really, there's been a dominance of altruism, empathy, and cooperation, without which human society could not have evolved. So aggression and war are not inevitable, but they are socially and historically created. And this needs to be emphasized in a perspective on nonviolence or in trying to develop a framework for nonviolence. So I don't have time to discuss historical social evolution at length, but just make a few remarks here. One, yes, domination and structural violence predated the modern era in different forms and ways. For example, in stratified feudal agricultural societies and also in kin-based communal foraging societies, there was violence and aggression, but they were not the predominant factors because without human cooperation and empathy, those societies could not have survived or evolved into new forms. But with capitalist development, what happens is the whole world becomes integrated into one global economic system. And gradually, all of humanity is incorporated within with this one global economic system. It is a monolithic system, which is not allowing alternative forms to survive. So both direct and indirect violence was used in creating this world order with highly unequal social classes, races, and regions as we have today. So Western imperialism and colonization of countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have been defining features of the capitalist world order. And even after political independence from the metropolitan countries, the colonized countries have continued to be controlled by the West through institutions like the Bretton Woods, that is the IMF and the World Bank, and through policies like neoliberalism, which promote privatization and corporate deregulation. Now, again, I don't have time to discuss these in detail, but I have done so, for example, in my latest book, The Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, where I look at the current financial strangulation of many of the indebted countries like Sri Lanka. Now, there have been attempts by colonized countries to assert their sovereignty and move on their own paths of development, but they have been thwarted again and again by the Western powers, led by the United States, through political and other forms of intervention, regime change, assassination of leaders, and so on, that we are seeing in a very major way right now. So let's look at capitalist development for a moment. There is no question that compared to the earlier feudal and hunter-gatherer societies, capitalism is a dynamic mode of production, which is driven by profit motive and constant growth. Certainly, it has brought forth incredible material advances and comforts. However, we should not assume its inevitability and uncritically uphold it, as many are prone to do, also partly because of capitalism's own propaganda. Rather, I think, particularly at this time of great conflict and destruction, it is very necessary to understand how the capitalist system works and where it is headed. So what we are seeing is, led by finance and technology, the capitalist economies seeking to subsume all of society and the environment within its fold. So today, practically all aspects of life are commercialized and penetrated by technology, and they're rapidly expanding into new areas of biology and consciousness. So profit-driven growth is able to do this because of a lack of ethical, ecological, and social justice criteria and accountability that is built into the capitalist decision-making process. Those are absent. So on the one hand, biodiversity is being lost on a massive scale very rapidly, but at the same time, synthetic biology is engineering more and more artificially created forms of plants and animals. And some even predict that very soon there'll be more lab-created forms of plants and animals than those found in nature. So algorithms are designing entirely new biological systems, blurring the line between organism and machine. And this is being extended into humanity as well. What is being referred to as transhumanism is seeking to make humanity also an extension of technology rather than a species in nature as it really is. But the techno-utopian elite celebrate it as inevitable progress and efficiency, and even calling it an upgrading of humanity to a godlike status. However, there's increasing fear growing around the world about what this means to humanity as a species in nature. Are we becoming dependent servants, simply taking orders from technology and losing our autonomy, creativity, and ability to think for ourselves? Is it a form of cognitive surrender and a form of violence against humanity? So here I think it's useful at least to pay some brief attention to what is being referred to as the attention economy. The attention economy treats cognitive focus that is human cognitive focus as a scarce resource to be algorithmically extracted, packaged, and commoditized. So we now have 24/7 digital connectivity that gives unregulated AI the power to shape human beliefs, desires, and behavior. And it is quietly and subtly transforming the human experience from the inside out. So it is raising existential questions. What does it mean to be human? Is this a form of violence against humanity rather than upliftment of humanity to a godlike status? So the combination of uncontrolled growth of social media, AI, virtual reality is displacing people from livelihoods, weakening family, community, and interpersonal bonds, and also increasing human loneliness. And there is, a lot of data and evidence of this. There's a rapid build out of mass data centers to generate AI, and that is already having profound environmental impacts on resources, from electricity grids to water supply and waste disposal. The centers are mostly owned by large private corporations, but the costs are borne by ordinary citizens and communities. So AI is raising moral and political concerns over safety, global authoritarianism, mass surveillance, and algorithmic oppression. The fear of loss of human agency and democracy is growing as AI-powered autonomous weapons are used in battlefields already in the Ukraine and the Middle East, as it is reported. So may I please see the first figure, the techno-capitalist paradigm. So the techno-capitalist paradigm, this is the attempt is to incorporate humanity and the environment within a virtual reality created by the market and technology. It treats the environment as a resource to be used for capitalist growth, and increasingly society also not only as labor and consumers, but also as data points for this attempt to incorporate humanity and environment, which constitute nature, within this virtual techno-capitalist reality. The BRICS, before I go on to look at the alternative perspective on nonviolence and ecology, let's briefly consider BRICS. Now, in many places, it's been argued that as US and Western dominance is coming to an end, it is being displaced by a new, more equal multilateral world led by the BRICS countries, constituting Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and many more who have joined the BRICS alliance. And many of them are former colonies of the West. while they're bringing forth some positive aspects in terms of financial transactions and greater equality, BRICS and the current geopolitical shifts that they are representing do not indicate a transformation necessarily towards a peaceful and just world, because they're following the same techno-capitalist model, pursuing profit and power. Now, China is said to be pursuing a strategy to win the global AI race. China's massive Belt and Road Initiative, and then India's attempts to colonize neighboring countries like Sri Lanka, these have massive implications for environmental sustainability, sovereignty, and the control of resources by local communities, which I've written about in other places. So let's look at this domination paradigm, which the techno-capitalist model represents. But it is really important to emphasize that technology and market themselves are not the problem. It is rather the intention and values that are driving their growth that are problematic. So we have to look at the psychological foundations of the domination paradigm and techno-capitalist growth. So underlying this insatiable growth and environmental structural violence is a worldview which is built on dualistic thinking and othering, us versus them. The survival of the self is equated with the power over the other. And this psychological dualism in turn gives rise to social structures of domination and subordination. For example, anthropocentrism, humans over nature, humans must conquer nature, imperialism, metropoles over colonies. For the metropolitan imperialist countries to survive, they must colonize and subordinate the colonial countries. So this kind of dualistic thinking is based on the notion of a separate self, and it encourages fear and the pursuit of domination using violence, even weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. It sees the self as separate and protecting that separate self rather than seeing the interdependence of all forms of beings and life on the planet. So here, I'm going to shift and turn to the Buddha's teaching for yet a deeper understanding of the psychological roots of domination and subordination and dualism. Now, the Buddha identified three poisons of the mind: greed, hatred, and ignorance. He showed that these are the ultimate root causes of violence, as well as all unwholesome actions and sufferings. He pointed out that greed stems from a belief that external things can bring lasting happiness, which is in many ways the foundation for unbridled economic growth. That hatred and aversion often arises when greed-driven desires are thwarted. So greed and hatred are two sides of the same coin. And delusion or ignorance stems from a fundamental misunderstanding, a wrong view of the reality of life, which in the Buddhist teaching refers to as the laws of nature or Dhamma. So the root cause is delusion or ignorance. The Buddhist teaching also identifies craving, tanha, that is the unwholesome desire for material possessions, sense pleasures, and existence itself that can never be fully satisfied as the root of suffering, or what is referred to as dukkha. And one can easily argue that the current economic system is built on developing craving, and it is built on the assumption that individual and social well-being inevitably increases with material growth and consumption. Modern advertising is built on the psychological manipulation of the assumed insatiability of human wants and desires. I mean, advertisement constantly promotes economic growth to keep it going. And now AI platforms are built to capture attention, which can further this trend of insatiability by curating choice through algorithmically reinforced craving, attachment, and desire. Yeah, can I have the second figure, please? Now, this shows that this is again the assumption, like the first figure showed the assumed incorporation of the environment and society within a technological and market-driven reality. And this assumes that the more you crave, the more you have growth, the greater it would be both individual and societal well-being. So this is the assumption that is driving the modern capitalist and technological growth. And it is, it's the assumption. It is not reality. It's not necessarily the truth that we know from experience. So let's look at avidya, ignorance, according to the Buddha's teaching. Craving and attachments to the concepts of self, me, and mind stem ultimately from ignorance. And ignorance is the lack of wisdom or understanding of the true nature of reality, Dhamma, as I said before. So what are the different aspects of reality, the true nature of reality? One is impermanence, that all mental and physical phenomena are subject to change, impermanence, including our lives. Another aspect, fundamental truth, is that there is a lack of a permanent, fixed, and separate self. Instead, there is interdependence of all physical and mental phenomena. Now, this reality was captured well by the Vietnamese Buddhist monk and scholar activist Thich Nhat Hanh's term, the term that he coined, interbeing, showing that all physical and mental phenomena and all beings were interconnected rather than, entirely separate entities. Now, the domination paradigm, which promotes this assumption of permanence, separate self, so on and so forth, has been associated with science and technological progress since the scientific revolution of the 17th century. But ultimately, it is founded on hubris, ego, and ignorance. That is a very fragmented and myopic understanding of life based on sort of human superiority and dominance. Now, ego consciousness and its ethics of individualism, competition, and domination are really at the root of the contemporary existential crisis. So let me finally shift to the more interesting and necessary part of the presentation on paradigm shift, which concurs with the objectives of the lecture series. So the lecture series is on Ahiṃsā, and you may have received much more information on Ahiṃsā from the other speakers, but let me just mention that Ahiṃsā is a Sanskrit term drawn from Jainism and Buddhism, and it refers to non-harming, non-injury, non-violence. Now, according to the Buddha's teaching, the shift towards non-violence must start with wisdom. It involves a deeper integration of knowledge with compassion that goes beyond mere accumulation and information. So wisdom is more than simply information and knowledge. Wisdom, according to the Buddhist teaching, incorporates right view, which is referred to as sammaditthi, and right intention, samma sankappa. And that leads to the elimination of ignorance. It leads to the realization of impermanence, that is the fleeting nature of all phenomena, and that ego is illusionary, and the real fact is the interdependence of all phenomena. So the assumption in this teaching is that with the weakening of attachment to the self, craving dissolves, thereby eliminating suffering and violence at their very source. But it is a great challenge, huge challenge to develop human wisdom and ecological consciousness, particularly in the context of expanding artificial intelligence, which is designed to control human attention. So the existential question is, how can this modern technology, particularly AI, be regulated to ethically foster peace, environmental sustainability, and economic justice instead of profit and domination? So here I think looking at the ecological paradigm is helpful. May I please have the third graphic? So the ecological approach correctly sees that the environment and the planet Earth and humanity, including humanity, has primacy over human-created spheres, and the environment encompasses society and economy rather than the other way around. The economy, with its components, including technology and finance and markets, is only one system of the society. The natural world does not need humanity for its survival, but humanity cannot survive without the environment. This is a very simple truth, but it's turned upside down in the dominant paradigm, which assumes that technology and market can take over nature. So there is a kind of foolishness of destroying our planetary life support systems for the purposes of economic growth and profit in the name of human well-being. So instead of the domination paradigm, the ecological paradigm helps us speak to the need for partnership. So humanity could not have evolved from pre-modern foraging agricultural societies and industrial stages to the current technological age without the predominance of partnership based on altruism, nonviolence over domination and aggression, as I said before. But to strengthen the universal consciousness over ego consciousness that seems to be dominating, we do need a vision of a new world of balance and harmony with nature and also within humanity as a family. So if more people develop critical reflection, like what is called for by this lecture series, and if more and more people transform their consciousness, they will be able to challenge unbridled technological and market growth and move the world towards an ethical path of sustainability and justice. The dominator paradigm and the virtual reality, they promote materialism, external image, and outer growth. But the kind of human liberation and transformation of consciousness that is required right now, both at the individual and the collective level, calls more for inner growth, the cultivation of generosity, compassion, and wisdom, rather than simply more and more technological and market growth. So we are talking about a middle path of balance and harmony. So let us again turn to the Buddha. The Buddha discovered the middle path based on his own life experiences. He had experienced a very indulgent way of life as a young prince, and then he experienced extreme denial in the process of being a mendicant seeking liberation. But through these extremes, he realized that neither extreme self-denial nor overindulgence brought contentment. And then he began to, with enlightenment, advocate the ethically based middle path of balance and moderation instead. So it is really explicated in the Buddha's teaching of the Eightfold Noble Path, which constitutes morality, concentration, and wisdom, Sila, Samadhi, Panya, which I'm not going to discuss here, and many of you as students of Buddhism would be familiar with that. The Buddha's middle path is commonly associated with mindfulness, equanimity, and individual liberation. But I will argue that it also has great applicability to social transformation. The middle path is not just about passivity. It is a very principled approach to openness, patience, and perseverance. It can help rise above the extremes of greed, hatred, and ignorance. So the kind of environmental sustainability and economic justice that is urgently needed in the world today call for balance and moderation in economic growth. It does mean that it requires a return to the status of the pre-capitalist stage. Now, in the pre-capitalist forager, hunter-gatherer stage, there was no real economic growth. Humanity remained at the same level of technological and economic growth for practically 99% of its history in the foraging stage. So that it's not necessary to return to stasis, no growth. But on the other hand, the continuation of unregulated frantic growth like we are having today is also not viable, sustainable. So the urgent question is, how can the middle path between no growth on the one hand and extreme growth on the other, a middle path be introduced to decision making rather than the no growth or unbridled growth? How can decision making move along a more balanced path with regard to decisions on production and consumption, including the adoption of appropriate technology and redistributive policies? So here, let me first look at the middle path to consumption. So the middle path calls for wisdom, that is inner transformation from insatiable craving to moderation. It calls for distinguishing between human needs and wants. Human needs need to be satisfied, but not craving and insatiable wants, which is what is happening now, at least the insatiable wants of a small minority at the top. So I presented you the linear consumption and well-being projection of the dominant paradigm in figure 2. The middle path says that after a certain point, increasing material consumption and resources actually decrease happiness and well-being, unlike what is assumed in the linear growth paradigm. So can I see the fourth graphic on the middle path equilibrium curve? So the middle path equilibrium curve illustrates that optimal material and spiritual well-being does not lie either in the extreme poverty, deprivation on the one hand, as you can see on the left, or in excessive wealth on the right, but in a balanced middle ground. Because after a certain point, consumption of resources, goods, and services is not going to bring increasing returns. In other words, optimum individual and social well-being, as well as environmental sustainability, result from balanced and shared consumption of resources and goods. Peace and violence can prevail with moral, equitable sharing of wealth and resources, rather than the continuation of extreme concentration and deprivation we see in the world today. So that's the middle path equilibrium curve. So, talking about sustainability and justice, if we are talking about a transition from unbridled growth to sustainable development, it requires not only changes in consumption, but also changes in ownership structures, production technologies, renewable sources of energy, and distribution methods and communication systems. So asking people to live simpler lives and consume less is not going to work, because people don't have much say over what is being produced. And as, for example, as software gets upgraded, we are forced to upgrade and buy the newer technologies, because there is no controls on changing production technologies, renewable sources of energy, which are driven by the growth imperative. So instead of treating AI alignment as strictly a technical problem subservient to the profit motive, a middle path approach could shift AI alignment to facilitate human intentions, values, and practices that foster peace, justice, and environmental protection. Now, along with this, community economics and bioregionalism, which advocate for local control of resources, food sovereignty, are more conducive to a middle path and the preservation ecosystems and social justice than the kind of globalized supply chains, agribusiness, and transnational corporate dominance that we are seeing. And just to give one example, with the closing of the Hormuz Strait, this has become very clear, particularly in Asian countries, because the food, the fertilizer, the fuel that are exported are not available and people are going hungry, their livelihoods are being lost and economies are coming to a standstill. And that's because of the way the economy is organized for so-called comparative advantage rather than local self-sufficiency and survival. These are issues I have explored in detail in some of my writings. Participatory democracy, too, is more compatible with social justice and local empowerment than centralized electoral and state systems. And this is something that more and people are recognized as they see that electoral democracy is really controlled by the powerful and the rich and wealthy, and it becomes only democracy in name, particularly with increasing militarization and authoritarianism in the so-called democratic countries. So let me move to nonviolence and resistance and the expansion of a nonviolence paradigm. So I think while I have talked much about domination and oppression, I think it is important to recognize that people don't have to be powerless victims of this dominant trend. More and more people around the world are acknowledging that human society is moving in a very self-destructive direction. Many, of course, are burdened by the struggle to survive, just to feed their families and keep themselves alive. And many are constrained by lack of opportunities to voice their concern. So they appear to be a silent majority, although more and more people are really concerned about the direction of social evolution. Now, the origin and the evolution of the current extremist economic system and the existential crisis facing us can largely be attributable to that small dominant elite. And we cannot expect this dominant elite to lead the way to an alternative, ecological, just, and peaceful world. While some of them are calling for the need for AI regulation and providing philanthropic services, however, their primary commitment is to maintain the status quo. However, without giving into fear, apathy, escapism, and hatred that seems to be tearing apart the human family and Mother Earth, human wisdom needs to be awakened, and the inner strength, courage, resilience that are our intrinsic birthrights need to be mobilized towards collective action and change. So let's look at nonviolent resistance a little bit. As I said before, the forces of domination and the forces of partnership have been in dialectical interaction throughout human history. And at the moment, the forces of domination and violence seem to be much stronger than those of partnership and peace. However, according to recent research, nonviolence resistance is more than twice as effective as violent campaigns. That is to say that militarism and violence that are dominant do not have to be resisted using more violence and violent resistance. I mean, it refers to the Buddha saying that hatred ceases not by hatred, but hatred ceases with love. So here, what is referred to as the 3.5% rule is helpful. It states that no government has ever survived a mass uprising when at least 3.5% of its population have continuously mobilized in nonviolent resistance. what this means is that this study, this finding was based on the study of hundreds of nonviolent movements, especially in the United States. What this means is that a small group can make significant change through well-organized nonviolent resistance. So this dominant narrative that is politically conditioned and driven by the mass media that says that people cannot do much to change the world is mistaken according to the evidence, which is oftentimes hidden by the mainstream media. There are, in fact, many nonviolent campaigns today, including labor union and community struggles against AI-related job displacement and data centers. And this kind of nonviolent resistance is likely to grow because of the rippling effects, because challenging not only AI and tech industry, but it can lead to challenging the system of structural violence that is impoverishing and dehumanizing people and destroying the earth because of the rippling effects of challenging AI data centers. So it should not be forgotten also that extreme weather, floods, wildlife, droughts, etc., that are associated with climate change can also wreak havoc on AI data centers and infrastructure, making them inoperable. So it is not just inevitable form of domination that is going to stay in place forever. So in trying to conclude my presentation, I want to turn briefly to Satyagraha, truth force. So nonviolent resistance, I think it's also important to recognize, particularly by those who may just not take it that seriously, that it has been a central component of global efforts to bring about systemic change for many decades. The nonviolent movement led by Mahatma Gandhi is the shining example. It was not only aimed at political sovereignty, which was referred to as Swaraj, but it was also a movement for economic and cultural independence from British imperialism. It was also a movement to create an alternative social system upholding local culture, economy, and technology. And that was referred to as Swadeshi. Now, Gandhi also approached nonviolence as a force of truth, Satyagraha, holding on to truth. And it was grounded on moral conviction and inner strength. And in doing so, he inspired many others to follow his example, one being Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States, who led the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement was also morally grounded movement. It was also a movement for economic justice and systemic change. So the current existential crisis with its widening militarization, ecological collapse, economic inequality, technological authoritarianism, all these things that I've talked about, calls also at the same time the intensification on nonviolent resistance. So what are some different ways of doing that? I will briefly refer to mindfulness. One pathway for expanding nonviolent resistance is to expand mindfulness practice. Mindfulness practice is basically drawn from the concept of sati taught by the Buddha, awareness. And mindfulness practice has become popular around the world, given the levels of stress and suffering that people are experiencing. But much of mindfulness training, particularly in the West and the United States, approaches it in a very narrow way as simply a technique to relieve stress and improve concentration. So much so that mindfulness training is now incorporated within the technology and market-driven status quo for individual success and corporate competition and even military advantage, because not only software companies, that the large companies like Google and Facebook have incorporated mindfulness practice, but even the US military apparently has incorporated mindfulness practice to increase efficiency, productivity, military advantage, and so on. But this approach to mindfulness is not the Buddhist approach. It needs to be broadened. The other important dimensions of the Buddha's Eightfold Path, besides sati, that is morality, sila, and wisdom, panya, need to be integrated into the practice of mindfulness and applied towards social change. So all these people who are sitting on their cushions, just trying to focus on their individual liberation, need to sort of open their hearts and minds to look at what's happening to the rest of humanity and the planet and expand their awareness as well as their compassion and wisdom. So while the Buddhist teaching emphasizes awareness and equanimity, it does not promote passive acceptance of reality, which may be what the very narrow approach to mindfulness may be doing. Rather, the teaching calls for applying morality, awareness, and wisdom and compassion in all realms, including collective social engagement. So I'm going to conclude my long remarks referring to wisdom. According to the Buddha, unwholesome feelings of greed and hatred always occur in conjunction with ignorance or delusion, moha, which is the root cause of violence and conflict. Now, since I talked a lot about AI, I will bring to mind that artificial intelligence excels at processing data and executing tasks, but it is not wisdom. Human intelligence, wisdom relies on lived experience, empathy, and ethics. And I will conclude my remarks by saying, quoting from the Buddha, that the wisdom is the key to ending violence and suffering. All unwholesome states of mind have their root in ignorance. They converge upon ignorance. And by abolishing ignorance, all the other unwholesome states are abolished. So thank you very much for your patience.